Hello, everyone. I'm Dante Aranda, and today I would love to talk about genetic engineering and kind of like how it affects our environment, but also to give application and light of the subject to people who are unfamiliar with its concepts or applications. First of all, let's talk about CRISPR-Cas9. That's a very kind of unique word for some who have never heard about it, and here is a diagram. How it works is we're basically cutting DNA sequences and replacing them with others that we desire, rather, and we're changing the total function of DNA. And so, as we see in the diagram, it's kind of replacing what was originally put with a new sequence, and the Cas9 enzyme, along with the guide RNA, is kind of shifting and changing that function. So on the left, we can kind of see the new desired sequence or the customized DNA. So that's kind of how the process works. We're just snipping, adding new, and it becomes a new sequence of DNA. So now that we kind of see a general understanding of the concept, that is how genetic engineering works. I want to make my position clear. Genetic engineering is the future. We should immediately implement its technology, ideas, to become fully aware and a well-rounded and functioning society with an improved environment, because that's what the scope of this class I'm in is all about, and kind of the scope of the general well-being of humanity for the next years to come. So, I want to talk about this with some applications. Firstly, let's talk about pollution cleanup or bioremediation. As we see here, there are two studies from Texas A&M and State University of New York at Buffalo, University of Pittsburgh. We kind of see two different ways that they're talking about it. I will show them and then talk about my general understanding, and then we can kind of compare them. So, bioremediation harnesses the metabolic capabilities of microorganisms to degrade or detoxify environmental pollutants, transforming them into harmless byproducts. Genetic engineering plays a crucial role in enhancing the efficiency and effectiveness of bioremediation strategies by engineering microorganisms with specific metabolic pathways tailored to target contaminants. For example, bacteria can be genetically modified to produce enzymes capable of breaking down toxic chemicals such as hydrocarbons, heavy metals, and pesticides. By introducing genes encoding these enzymes into bacterial strains, researchers can create bioaugmentation systems that accelerate pollutant degradation in contaminated environments. So, that was my general understanding. And basically, we're modifying DNA sequences to target nasty things in the air, taking them out and kind of breaking them as byproducts, or things that don't really do anything. So this is super important to kind of depollute that air that we breathe, especially in places with super contaminated environments. So we kind of shown what they were studying about. So let's dive into another application: sustainable agriculture and crop resistance. As we kind of see here in this chart, it's talking about, the contribution of genetically engineered crops to sustainability. So we have crops produce, crop productivity enhances. We have a decrease in agriculture footprints. We have, helping in biodiversity conservation. So we have these three applications. We can kind of see more in this chart, where we have, the modified version is kind of really changing our environmental understanding, right? It's targeting 4 different sectors: an economic and environmental, social, and a sustainability effort. We have a healthy environment. We can see that the modified crop is a little bit bigger and healthier. We can kind of see tons of things that are kind of changing as we modify those crops, as seen in the previous chart. So let us talk about kind of the general understanding again. Genetically modified crops help address climate change by making agriculture more resilient, as we saw, to environmental stress. These crops are engineered with traits like drought tolerance, insect resistance, herbicide tolerance, and disease resistance, which improve productivity in major crops such as corn, rice, soybeans, and cotton. These are really, really important, as well as potatoes. Climate change is increasing global temperatures and causing unpredictable rainfall, which reduces crop yields, threatens food security. So GM crops kind of offer a solution by helping plants survive harsh conditions and maintain stable food production. Many countries, including the United States, Brazil, Argentina, and Canada, support and allow the commercial use of GM crops. But however, regions like the European Union are more restricted. They only use them for animal feed. So there are still some concerns about their socioeconomic impact, regulation and long-term safety, which we will dive in a little bit. But because of growing challenges such as climate change, many argue that this technology should just be implemented because people are unsure about where their food will come from. And we will talk about that as well. So, next, let us dive into this topic called ecosystem restoration. And so we kind of see in this chart, we have a remediation cycle, as well as a rehabilitation cycle and eventually ecological restoration. So it all starts from the beginning. And so as we read this chart, I'm going to talk about the general understanding as we've done. So firstly, genetic engineering plays a role in ecosystem restoration by influencing how agriculture interacts with surrounding natural environments, right? So it's allowing scientists to directly modify a crop's DNA to add useful traits, as we've talked about, especially resistance to insects and herbicides. In the period covered, most genetically engineered crops were designed to protect plants from damage rather than to increase their natural growth capacity. So, for example, insect-resistant crops can defend themselves against specific pests, while herbicide-resistant crops allow farmers to control weeds more effectively without relying so much as mechanical tilling or broad pesticide use. So as a result, genetic engineering can reduce the overall need for chemical input and limit crop losses caused by insects and weeds, which may help reduce environmental stress on nearby ecosystems. So, however, the impact of these traits depend heavily on conditions such as pest pressure, farming practices, and landscape management, which is really, really widespreadly known in the field. Meaning that in some areas, genetically engineered crops may provide limited environmental benefit. In the context of ecosystem restoration, genetic engineering functions as a tool that can indirectly support healthier ecosystems by lowering certain forms of agriculture pressure, but it does not directly restore ecosystems on its own, right? It's not the only factor in changing what we know. So, we can kind of see that, however, it is reducing that stress. Right, these implementations are lowering that need for those heavy pesticides, which we've seen in the Silent Spring, that it's not the best for humans to consume. And so, with that factor, we're completely ridding the negatives of pesticides, of crop losses, and chemical outputs. So next, I would want to talk about the cons because, as we see, there are cons. People talk about them, but are they? And that's the main thing. So the cons are, I'm going to put this in a light way. They're not really cons. We can kind of see here some disadvantages. These crops contain the DNA of other plants. They have low nutritional value. The crops are resistant to antibiotics, and genetically modified crops have increased toxic pollution or production at levels that are already harmful to humans. And what I mean, I'm going to talk about one more. Here are some more concerns and risks. And so, we kind of see a lot of things, lots and lots of things that can be concerning to people, which is totally understanding. But I don't think any of these are actually cons, and I'm going to explain why right now. And I'm saying this because, first, let's give a general understanding so we can learn about it, right? So genetic engineering and agriculture biotechnology have the potential to reshape ecosystems in a way that are difficult to fully predict or control. We know this. So even small genetic changes in crops can lead to large environmental consequences. So when those crops are introduced on a wider scale, as noted by U.S. national academics, the commercialization of genetically engineered crops can alter farming systems in ways that affect surrounding ecosystems in a way. And so, because these impacts may only become visible after widespread adoption, some effects cannot be fully detected through limited pre-market testing alone. So we'll talk about that in a second. But another concern is that genetically modified crops may interact with existing ecosystems in complex and unintended ways. Agriculture systems have already been heavily altered by environments, and introducing genetically engineered traits that can kind of change how the species compete, spread, or respond. And so the unpredictability makes long-term ecological monitoring essential. So since some impacts may only emerge after years of large-scale cultivation. And kind of what this is saying is we don't really know what will happen in the short term. We're not too sure. In the long term, bad things might happen. And so you have to take these things with a grain of salt. You got to understand that this could be bad now, but it's already bad now. And so when you're not adding these things now, eventually we're just going to be in a state where no one has food, no one has that security of food, no one has those plants that are surviving these harsh climate changes that we're already experiencing. And so I think you have to take these cons, like I said, with a grain of salt. And it's kind of like a veil. We're not too sure what's on the other side. But I can tell you now that the positives are backed. They are real. The negatives, they're more maybe. This might happen. This could happen. It could be unpredictable, or it could be harder to control. But we can, kind of dive away and talk about China. And what I mean by China is they have widespread nuclear reactors, and they're already producing and making clean energy on the daily, and it's one of their main sources of thought right now. This is what they're focusing on. And so I believe, the United States should implement this technology, just contrary to, how China is implementing that nuclear power. Oh, it's scary, yes, but it's efficient. And it's cutting that waste. It's cutting that pressure on the environment. It's clean energy. And so we can apply that thought process here. We can see that this works. It's already been working. There has been studies that this works, and it's been going on for 20 years. A man, PhD, he talked about this, and 20 years it's been working. And so what I think it's scary for sure. But that doesn't mean it's wrong, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't implement it. And so now we can talk about some ethical stuff. We can kind of see a broad idea that genetic engineering in agriculture raises several important ethical considerations. Right? So is it right for humans? Does it have environmental damages? And is the perception of technology being unnatural? Right? Some critics argue that altering the genetic makeup of organisms crosses a moral boundary. It also reports no clear line that genetic modification inherently unacceptable. So it's not saying that it's too bad. Instead, it's kind of suggesting that the ethical concerns should be focused more on the method itself rather than like the outputs. And that's kind of what I was saying is like, it's doing good. And so we shouldn't focus on the outputs, but rather let's focus on like the hammer and nail, right? And so that's kind of like the main ethical problems. There's also some principles saying that like people should definitely have the right about what they eat. There should be clear labeling and continued availability for non-GM food options. So additionally, governments and scientists have a duty to communicate accurate information and address public concerns honestly, helping maintain confidence in both the technology and the institutes that regulate it. So ethical considerations also extend to global equity and the distribution of food benefits. The Nuffield Council highlights a moral obligation to use genetic engineering to improve food security. Like I said, people don't have food. They don't. And so it's improving that food security, but also, it's particularly in developing countries where hunger and agriculture challenges are way more severe than here or countries with that power. However, ensuring fair access to these technologies is essential. And as economic barriers and intellectual property restrictions can limit their availability to small-scale farmers, ultimately the ethical acceptability of GM crops depends on how they're regulated, shared, implemented, and, with focus on maximizing benefits while minimizing the harm and inequality. We kind of see this with the technology screen divide. We have mass technology here and in China and the main powers of the world, but we see that other places don't, and they struggle with medicine, they struggle with food security, they struggle with housing, clothing, and technology. So this is kind of just one of those things where we really should pay attention to the transparency and public trust. I don't want to eat something that I don't know what's in it, and I don't think you do as well. So these ethical concerns are not issues, but rather just, things that we should bring up, things that are important to note. We should know that scientists should tell people what they're eating. Governments should be regulating this and distributing it equally. Right. So, all those applications that we've seen, all the considerations, the cons, we can note that in these instances, we see an overwhelmingly positive effort from genetic engineering, not only on our environment, but also in our applications as a species. We see pollution cleanups. We see food equality. We can see disease resistance, rather. We can see tons of benefits. And, it's not just me who's thinking like this. There are organizations here as well that want to do something. And they strive to kind of implement this technology just as much as I want it to be implemented. I think that these things are so beneficial for our environment, for our well-being, and we should implement them as soon as possible. So overall, that was my argument. I feel like the applications are they make sense, and this is kind of one of those things where it's common sense. Let's do it because this will help us. This will bring food to the table for people who don't have access to food. This will, those farmers who live on these things, they will have an easier time. And so, all in all, thank you for listening, and I hope that I kind of leaned you in the way of wanting this technology to be implemented and kind of learning a little bit more. So thank you, and have a great day.